2006 and organizes reading groups, public fora, such as this, research and journalism focusing on problems of the tasks inherited from the old 1920s and 1930s left, the new 1960s and 1970s, and the post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The Austin chapter has been meeting since 2017. We hold a weekly social hour at 7 p.m. in the Union Underground and a reading group every Sunday from 2 to 5 p.m. in Berdeen, room 128. If you want any more information, feel free to talk to me afterwards. You can also find our website. It's platypus1917.org. Our final panel for today is What is Marxism For? So just really quickly, what we're going to do is we're going to have each of our speakers give a 10-minute opening statement, and then they will each have 2 minutes to respond to each other before we open up the floor for a Q&A. And to kind of knock off what Marxism is for, the legacy and future of Marxism, both as a guiding theory and a political movement of human freedom, has questionable utility for our current political moment. While the relevance of the 19th century's critique of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels continues to be felt, as evidenced by the continued return to the question of socialism in leftist politics, the success of the Marxist project of human freedom feels far from certain or secure. The memory of the 20th century communism, as well as more recent political movements carrying the banner of socialism, weighs heavily on any political movement that today attempts to tend to the tasks Marx outlined close to 200 years ago. In contemporary leftist politics, Marxism has been invoked to justify supporting the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, participating in Black Lives Matter, and resisting the Trump presidency and anti-fascism. It prompts a question for us today of what is Marxism for the left, and what does it accomplish for contemporary leftist politics? What is the relevance of Marxism today, if there is a necessity to recover or return to Marxism, and what would it mean to go beyond it? What is the point of leadership by Marxist intellectuals, and is that even necessary? So just to introduce our panelists for today, on my right here is Clint. Clint has studied at the University of Chicago and Leipzig. He's a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. In the middle is Professor Maurizio Viroli, who is currently a professor at the government at the University of Texas and has had many prior appointments. His most recent book is Prophecy and Social Emancipation in the History of Italy. It's coming out in a month. And the panelist on the furthest right is Adam Benden. Adam Benden is an LCSW supervisor, a trauma therapist, and an adjunct professor of social work, organizer, and activist based in Austin, Texas. He has a background in Marxist political theory and philosophy, which has been a large part of his studies and work in organizing for the last 8 years. He has worked with organizing social groups around labor issues, Marxist-Leninist groups, and Maoist mass line focused work with tenants and mental health needs for underdeserved college students. Adam is also the host of the podcast Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left and subjective conditions, exploring the mind and body under capitalism. So, Clint, if you could take it away.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start off with 2 provocations. First, the left always gets what it wants, but in the worst possible way. The left is the consciousness of possibility in history. What the left imagines and then fails to do is by definition taken up by the right. The right, by definition, conserves the latest phase of capitalism because capitalism can be conserved only by transforming itself. The left then blames the right for its own failure to lead society beyond capitalism. Second, the highest aspiration of the millennial left was overcoming neoliberalism and postmodernism by way of a national welfare state jobs program, a return to the 1930s by way of a newer, greener New Deal. Neoliberalism and postmodernism may well be overcome by a national jobs program, but the left, having missed its moment to be born in the millennials, will be tailing it. These previous moments of capitalism hardly disappear. Their missed potential rather accumulates in their suppression, so that they fester like wounds on the prevailing health of the present. The history of capitalism can be written only by reference to what the left failed to do. Otherwise, we are antiquarians servicing policy mandates by the democratic managers of social crisis, which, hence the provocation, is effectively what the millennial left was, but did not have to be. The 20th century is largely blockage, impeding our access of the deeper potentials and problems of the 19th century. So with my opening remarks, I will not foreground the old, new, and millennial left. The left of the 20th century, whether the old 1930s Stalinist left or the new 1960s new left that tried to break from Stalinism but further entrenched its assumptions, is just various echoes of this original failure, the failure to realize the 19th century. Everything the new left wanted got realized as neoliberalism. Against the monolithic bureaucratism of the high Stalinist Keynesian state, we got the sexual emancipation of dating apps, the black emancipation of affirmative action, colonial emancipation as third world nationalism and decolonized curricula, instead of the factory line flexibility. This is the postmodernism plus neoliberalism that the millennial left reacted against, as announced by Bhaskar Sunkara's first article in Jacobin magazine. But the only reachback was to the same 1930s, 1950s welfare state that the new left reacted against. The millennial left would have, instead, to have recognized how neoliberalism realized the very revolution demanded by the new left, as opposed to one-sidedly rejecting and therefore repeating both. The deeper potential of the 19th century was expressed by liberalism and socialism as the demand for the democratic republic. Essential to the older democratic republic under Cromwell, Jefferson, Robespierre was not democracy, but republicanism, and essential to republicanism was not governance, but the rights of labor. The republic was the conscious expression of the division of labor, commercial society, the political form taken by the revolt of the Third Estate, the way that labor could govern itself by asserting its own rights. The republic was not a class instrument under Cromwell, Jefferson, and Robespierre, as many claim today following not Marx, but progressive historians like Charles Beard. The republic was instead an instrument of global civil society. In the wake of the French Revolution and Restoration, the demand for French, German, Italian, Hungarian, Polish republics began, however, to run up against a contradiction intrinsic to that global civil society. If the republic is the way that labor asserts its own right, then what happens when labor itself begins to contradict itself? When the tools of labor, the means, machines, and methods of production begin to outstrip labor, rendering living labor itself obsolete. The global slave revolt, the bourgeois revolution in labor, became industrial. On the one hand, the Industrial Revolution opened up heretofore unimaginable potentials for humanity, but it did so by destroying humanity, by reducing living labor to the most worthless of commodities. It is for this reason, the industrial self-contradiction of revolutionary labor, that democracy enters the scene. If in the 18th century I did not care who owned the farm or the pin factory I worked at for a wage, because with that wage I could participate in society, in the 19th century, the productivity of the machine was now predicated on my unemployment. It is because the machine, the tool of labor, was excluding labor that labor turned to the state, to democracy, to represent its interest against the owners of the machine, who were just as subject to it even if they seemed to profit from it. Democracy is the expression of industrial crisis. Thus, Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party split into Jacksonian democracy and the Whigs. Jefferson himself spent his final years commending the utopian socialist experiments. The Democratic Party, with Jackson as the leader, bringing together pioneer farmers, northern urban immigrant workers, and southern planters in the name of the common man against the banks and money grubbers, marked the advent of the industrial era and its attendant crisis in democracy. The Democratic Party was opposed in the very first election by incipient working men's parties in the northern manufacturing centers, who aimed to continue the American Revolution against the Jacksonian Democrats by asserting politically the independent right of labor. This industrial contradiction and its expression in democracy came to a head in 1848 in Europe. Young Hickory in America had concluded the Mexican-American War by annexing Texas, California, New Mexico, and the first serious industrial working class, the English proletariat, presented their democratic charter for a republic to Parliament to be turned away. But the Hydra broke out in Paris and across Europe. In Paris, the workers' demand for a social democratic republic, meaning employment. They were massacred, and on their ashes, the democratic republic was erected, before it collapsed into Louis Bonaparte, who dissolved the republic in the name of democracy, who was elected to be dictator in order to save the revolution whose failure he consolidated. The same problem was repeated in Italy, in Germany. Rather than allow the workers to lead the revolution, the bourgeoisie preferred to betray it. The workers turned to democracy to fight for the social question and got swallowed up by it. Marx called the socialism of Louis Bonaparte imperial socialism, or Bonapartism. Here's Kautsky on the left getting what it wanted, but not in the way it wanted. Quote, "It came about that the victors of the revolution were driven by the logic of the facts to enter the revolutionary stage and to resume the work of the revolution of 1848. In order to keep the revolution away from France, Napoleon III was compelled to overturn old Russia and to force its masters to abolish serfdom. He was likewise compelled to unite Italy and to cause Austrian absolutism to totter. Bismarck completed the subversion of Austrian absolutism, dethroned several German lords, brought France the Republic and Germany universal suffrage, and to a certain degree, unity." End quote. Marx saw how deep the task of continuing the bourgeois revolution in labor was. The social question would have to lead the democratic republic. But because the social question was just the crisis and degeneration of the bourgeois revolution, this question would have to be posed politically at the start to even begin addressing it. Rather than Louis Bonaparte, the proletariat as a class would have to become dictator to save society by overcoming its own industrial contradiction. This is the 101 of Marxism. What Marx did not produce was a new positive theory. Marxism is the critique that the bourgeois revolution has of itself in the industrial era, the critique of socialism. The most bourgeois thing to do would be to overcome bourgeois society by realizing it. The Civil War in America, the First International, and the Civil War in France raised the question of the Republic of Labor, but it was not yet answered with proletarian leadership. The torch passed from the Paris Commune to the German proletariat and the emergent party of social democracy, leading and organizing the Second International founded 100 years after the Great French Revolution. The only two actual parties founded in the 19th century were the Republican Party in the United States and the Social Democratic Party in Germany. The original bourgeois revolutionary meaning of a party was to complete a revolutionary task and then completed to disband into society. The Republican Party was founded to complete the bourgeois revolution of free labor, a task that was already proletarian socialist. The party in Germany was founded to spearhead socialism. That these two were parties and not reducible to democracy is precisely their Republican aspect, what rises above mere democracy, to complete the revolution. They had a task that went beyond their immediate existence. This task, the party, was once the point of Marxist intellectuals. The purpose of the party precedes the party. Marxists were ahead of the curve of history because they showed the world what it already wanted. And they showed the world where it was going because their eyes were trained upon the past, seeing the present as deepening the same old thing, and therefore alone being of service, negatively, to the possibility of something new.
Clint, I hate to cut you short, but that was a little over 10 minutes, so if you want to just wrap things up shortly, and then you have a minute or two, probably be okay.
All right. So to conclude, I'll make 3 points in answer to the question. Marxism is not a positive theory or worldview. There's only been one revolution so far, the bourgeois revolution, the slave revolt of the Third Estate, the assertion of labor. Marxism was this ongoing bourgeois revolution's critique of itself under conditions of industrial production, as the rights of labor became expressed in the demand for socialism. 2, Marxism is not reducible to democracy. Democracy rather expresses the industrial crisis of social relations. Democracy is the arena to prosecute that crisis, but its end is beyond democracy. Its end is society. And then 3, all the democratic republics that have since been called into existence, from Weimar to the Congo, are fetishized as an end in themselves, but themselves express a deeper legacy of failure. To put it bluntly, the Democratic Republic was obsolete by 1848. This is not to say that the Democratic Republic can simply be pushed aside and replaced with a commune. It's rather to recognize the different historical task underlying it. This was already the conflict between Marx and the Mazzinians in the First International. The industrialization of global civil society meant that we have to have global capital in view.
Thank you very much. Excellent stuff, man.
Thank you.
Great stuff.
I appreciate that.
Wow. That is great. Okay. Thank you very much, dear friends of the Platypus Society. I know the existence of your congregation, I think 3 weeks ago, is that? But it has been a marvelous surprise for me here in Austin, Texas, to get to know you. And I thank you, I sincerely thank you for your efforts to keep alive a tradition of social and political thought, the tradition of Marx and Engels and Marxism, that it has sustained and inspired, directly or indirectly, in various ways, what I think is fair to describe as the most powerful vision of social and political emancipation of our times. I think this is fair to say. I think all the historians and political theorists that I know agree that in terms of capacity of mobilizing and sustaining experience of social life, Marxism has been the most powerful. But it's a tradition that almost everywhere and almost completely is now forgotten or derided. No. And this is one more reason to commend you for your intellectual courage. You are swimming against the current. You are going against the conventional mentality, against the predominant ideologies about political and social life. It's not easy. Let me say before few more words about myself. I want to share with you the simple fact that all my life I've always been a socialist, but never a Marxist. If to be a Marxist means to support all Marx and Engels theories, all of them, as we say in America, it's a package deal. I still repeat my claim, the claim I want to discuss with you. It is to say that in Marx and in Engels, we can find the most inspiring and fascinating vision of social and political emancipation for our times. As a profession, as a student, as a scholar, I'm a historian, so I tend to look at matters from the historical point of view. But my claim is that in Marx and Engels we can find a theory that is for our times. Which theory? Here I'm engaging in an exercise that I've learned from my, how shall I say, mentor or theorist to whom I have dedicated most of my works, Niccolò Machiavelli, who has taught us many years ago that if we want to revive, bring back to life states, religions, or movements, we have to go back to their founding true principles. So that's exactly the exercise I want to share with you, to try to go back to the founding principles of the socialist vision of emancipation, to retrieve them, to get them right, and to bring them back as guiding principles for political and social actions. Which principles am I talking about? Which are the principles of Marx and Engels that we need to recover? It's very simple. Man das höchste Wesen für den Menschen sei. This is to say, it's from the contribution to the critique of Hegel's political philosophy of right of 1844. The translation, I think, is quite felicitous in the Marx-Engels reading. Man is the supreme being for man. They mean humanity, not males. They mean humanity. It ends, therefore, with a categorical imperative to overthrow all those conditions in which human beings mentioned, they mean human beings, are abased, enslaved, abandoned, contemptible beings. That's the beginning of the story. To react against all forms of social life in which human beings are abased, humiliated, enslaved, abandoned, reduced to contemptible beings. In fact, Marx, who, as you probably know, has been interpreted as a scientific writer. In fact, he had many poetic pages. He speaks of the idea of changing the perspective and to bring the human beings as their own true sun, revolving around themselves, as opposed to revolving around something else. This means that Marx's political theory begins with an assertion of what? Of the idea of liberty as non-domination. This distinguished fellow has mentioned earlier on republicanism. That's exactly the core of the tradition of Republican political thought that goes back to Roman Republic, and has had important enhancements in Italian Renaissance. What does it mean that to be free in the sense of absence of domination? It means that we are free as long as we are not subject to the arbitrary will of other human beings. It's different from the liberal idea of liberty that says that we are free as long as we are not obstructed, prevented from attaining the goals that we want to attain. To be free in the sense that of the statement that I have just read from Marx means that you are not in the position of a servant or a slave. That is to say, you are not under the arbitrary power of another man. Capitalists, or the state, or the market, or God. That's the idea of Marx. Not to be under the power of any arbitrary power. That's the Marxian idea of social emancipation. Of course, it's not, like I said, it's not the idea that liberty means not to be under the arbitrary power of anybody. Has a long tradition. But Marx has given to this old idea a greater, a new scope, because it has transformed that idea that in the past was primarily a theory of emancipation from tyranny into the idea, or sometimes the idea of emancipation from social exclusion. Marx has done more, has developed the idea of liberty as absence of domination into a theory of emancipation from social alienation. The alienation that people suffer for when they are treated as means for somebody else's ends. The emancipation that Marx designed is the idea of emancipating human beings from all the forms of social life in which they are simple means for the achievement of other human beings' desires of power and domination. How should this type of emancipation be attained? Here I'm going again, I'm focusing again on the young Marx, in particular the famous letter to Arnold Ruge, 1844, in which Marx speaks of reforming consciousness, changing the consciousness of the oppressed. That is the issue of emancipation. You have emancipation when those who are servants or slaves or oppressed, they attain the sense of their own worth and as human beings, they no longer want to serve other men because they know that this is debasing and humiliating, that it compresses the intellectual and moral energies of human beings. So at the core of the Marxist idea, of the original Marxian idea of emancipation, there is this idea of liberating human beings, all human beings, from all forms of domination. That's why I said that Marx's idea of emancipation connects to, develops, reinforces what exactly Marx was saying in this letter to Arnold Ruge, a vague dream, the dream of something that has been always there in the history of humanity. Dream, I think the right translation would be a vision, namely when human beings have envisaged, imagined forms of social life radically different from the social forms in which they are living. That's exactly what Marx has given us, and that's exactly what we should treasure. That is exactly what we should work on. How? Well, there is more, but maybe next time. Because on this idea you can build, for instance, the idea, in order to use another works by Marx, of a revolution of the majority. What does it mean, revolution of the majority? That you cannot possibly change society in the direction of liberating human beings from all forms of arbitrary domination if you focus only on the working class. Then, in Marx's time, this was impossible. Now it's unthinkable. So we have to go with Marx, beyond Marx, where? Two names, and I'm done. I think we should treasure the analysis of, you're going to think I'm a nationalist. I have many vices, but nationalist certainly not. We have to treasure Antonio Gramsci's legacy. He understood perfectly well this problem. And the legacy of Carlo Rosselli, the theorist of liberal socialism. He died in 1937, assassinated by fascist members of an extreme right movement supported by Mussolini. He has written, while he was in exile, in police confinement in Lipari, a magnificent book. Read it. Liberal Socialism. It's translated into English by Princeton University Press. I've spoken too long. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
All right, thank you to my fellow panelists. That was great, and this is going to be hard to follow, but I will do my best. Any panel where I'm sitting next to a fellow Gramsci admirer and lover is a good panel to be on. It's funny because I was thinking about how to prepare remarks for today, and I think I took Lewis's guiding questions literally. I'm just going to try to talk about these questions and what they mean to me. And maybe my perspective will be a little bit different because I'm coming into this from my labor as a therapist, but also my work as an activist and an organizer. And it's funny because when I think about what Marxism is for, one of the things that's important to me is that Marxism that doesn't have heart and isn't like blood and guts Marxism, it's like I don't give a shit about it, honestly. Marxism for me has to be able to do something in my life.
Okay.
And in the life of the people around me, like my friends, my loved ones, my family, the people that I see who show up traumatized, alienated in my work. So for me, Marxism is a deeply personal thing to relate to. It's funny, my first answer to like, what is Marxism for? I was like, well, what was it for me? Like, what did it do for me? And I remember it was coming from a working class background with two, union member parents, and then being very apolitical. But then working, like interacting with different class strata within Austin as Austin was developing 10 years ago. And Marxism for me was the first thing that helped me understand like what was going on in my life and why I was suffering. Like, why is it that I would go to service these like very rich upper elite people in Austin and I was driving a, broken down 10-year-old Chevy Blazer, and I'm like trying to make sense of like what is going on in this world that I'm a part of. And so for me, Marxism was a way of understanding the world. and it was a way of understanding my life. And as I started to study it more formally, the idea of Marxism as the immanent critique of capitalism from within the conditions of capitalism still holds true. And so for me, I come into this loving Marxism as a method, and also loving it so much that I want to critique the hell out of it and bring a lot of questions into this as well. Because the first question I had is like, well, what is Marxism for? It's like, okay, well, if we all want to at least somewhat agree that it's an immanent critique of capitalism, then it begs the question, well, what is the state of capitalism from which we are critiquing? Like, what are we actually involved in? Like, what is the nature of the wage-labor relation? What is the absolute destruction on the human psyche and the body and community social relations that we're trying to make sense of? And I asked that question like with a lot of like compassion and like desire for like solidarity, for lack of a better word. So for me, that question was a starting point, was to say like, okay, well, what is happening around me? And I need a way to understand that. So Marxism for me was that method. But, the question I still have today is like, is it the best current method of critique? Like, does it actually capture what we're all dealing with? And whenever we think about, do we need to go beyond Marx, I had another question. Well, what does it mean to go beyond Marx? I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to be in good company, but I actually am kind of postmodern myself. So I love like postmodern critique and those theorists. And so I find a lot of value in them, but I still come back to Marx at the end of the day. But I want to bring them in because they do help understand what is the nature of capitalism that we're critiquing, that we're all experiencing the subjective degradation. And I think a lot of the words you used, Maurizio, were beautiful about like abandonment and just the contemptible destruction of human life and alienation. Like that to me still is the problem. And it's what I see every day in my labor and in my work, why people show up and like in what I'm trying to help people overcome, hopefully. So I think that those critiques I would want to ask and sort of hopefully have some pretty, hopefully good discussion with everyone here around like, are those critiques relevant to us in this room? Like how do we combine those with Marxism? Do we find that there's value in all of them? And I think this kind of leads to maybe for me another big element of what is Marxism for, and I think about the way that the constant experience, I think for most people, regardless of how privileged they might be, is this constant breakdown in the, let's say, the continuity of our existence and the complete atomization and separation from us as like the species being, right? And that's still, to me, young Marx or not, like that still is what we're all trying to grapple with. And I think probably what brings us all to this room in a way. So in terms of maybe what I was curious about and thinking about what does it mean to go beyond something, thinking about, well, people have been attempting to go beyond Marx. I've heard that said over and over again for years and like trying to study the theory and the history as much as I could. And I've always been like curious about that. I always find that, I read these amazing critiques of things and then at the end it's like, well, the answer is we need to go beyond this thing. And I'm always like, cool, like, is that, a leftist movement? Is that being involved in a labor union? Like, what does that mean exactly? So I kind of bring that not as I have an answer, but just as a question for us to consider. If that is part of what we need to do, like, what would it mean to do that? I would like to know as a philosophical question. And maybe this is where people like Gramsci and some other big influences on me, like Walter Benjamin, have been pretty amazing and I think are really close to my heart and what it means to be a Marxist today, whatever that might mean. And I do think it's probably important to say, as you were also mentioning, Maurizio, like I don't think Marx would have considered himself a Marxist.
Never.
So, that
He
would
said
also,
that.
Yeah.
He said,
Yeah, so I think that that's something I was also thinking about. Like, what does it even mean to say that? Like, what does it mean to say that I am attached to this method of critique, if that's what we want to think of it as? Like, what would it even mean to call oneself a Marxist? Or is it easier to just say, yeah, we're a socialist or a communist or something? But I do think, in my experiences in activism and organizing, I was thinking about, I don't know if I've ever really encountered Marxism, to be quite honest. I find myself wanting to go to these different political tendencies and looking for that, hoping I will find something that maybe helps me feel a little bit less alienated, and always coming away finding that I feel more alienated than ever before, because it was like, that was the thing that was supposed to not alienate us. And yet I found myself feeling that even more intensely in those moments. And so for me, I think in terms of bending me, and I think about, well, what if Marxism is something that we're still looking for? Like, I think I'm still looking for it. And so I like to think about the idea that maybe we're not like recovering something, because I don't even know what that would mean to recover Marx, but maybe in a kind of dialectical way, if I dare use a perhaps forbidden word, maybe to recover Marx would be to find Marx for the first time today, like in our lives right now. Because reading the history and stuff, this has all been very powerful and meaningful in my life, but at the end of the day, it's like, what is Marxism for? It's like, it's not for much if I can't use it to help me understand what does it mean to be quote unquote revolutionary in my day-to-day life, or be part of something that hopefully could be revolutionary, and whatever that word might mean. So I think, just to wrap up my comments, I think that the idea of Marxism as a project of human freedom and human emancipation, that still rings true to me. And that's why I always gravitated towards the younger Marx. And I think in my work, as a therapist, let's say, and all the class position elements that entails, the thing I do know is like, well, what is Marxism for? It's like, it's still something that people find relevance in. I think we all find relevance in to help us understand, like, what is it that we're experiencing? Like, where does the source of our pain and suffering come from? Because that's what led me to find an answer in Marxism, or at least a method to make sense of it. And so maybe I'll leave that as just the thing I'd like to bring to this, is what is it for? It's hopefully a way to find freedom, reduce alienation, and that seems as relevant today as it's ever been.
I think so too.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That was fantastic. So we're going to start with just 2 minutes so you can engage with the other panelists. Clint, if you'd like to take it away.
Sure. So I would say you're not finding Marxism anywhere because there is no more Marxism. And I would say that Marxism has very long been dead. And if anything, it sort of exists as a ghost. And then the reason for that is because, so you said, the imminent critique of capitalism. And Marx was able to make this imminent critique of capitalism because he had an imminent object. And that object was the actual working class movement for socialism. So we no longer have a working class movement for socialism that is actually posing the question of capitalism, and therefore we can't actually critique capitalism. So because there's no more horizon beyond capitalism, there's no more politics of the working class pressing for socialism, we know Marxism is no longer here. It's not just like a method that you can apply to this or that. It isn't just like we are like 20 years after the 20th century, like we are way down the rabbit hole of regression, and there's no more Marxism really happening right now. So we're remembering the memory of a memory. Mm-hmm. So recognizing that there are like class strata, that there's rich people and poor people, that's liberalism. Recognizing that, that labor should organize into a union, and protect the value of their wages, that's liberalism. Recognizing, that people are deformed by, mental health and everything, that's also liberalism. And that's not saying that's a bad thing. Marxism is a critique of the liberal workers' movement. But yeah, so I'm saying there is no more Marxism because its object, the movement for socialism, isn't there. And then secondly, I want to make sure that I'm not being misunderstood. So I don't think that Marxism can be reducible to like Republican liberty.
No.
So maybe the reason why somebody wouldn't want to like take the whole package deal of Marxism is because there is truly a demonic element to it. So it's like, when you had the French Revolution, when you had, the American Revolution, they dressed themselves up in the togas of the Roman Republic. But they were bringing to expression something far vaster, which is the global social revolution in labor. Okay. The social, it is social freedom that has like fundamentally posed a break between the new world, modernity, and the old world. Mm-hmm. And it's actually that historical freedom that Marxism is about.
Very good.
And so it's that social historical freedom, and that's why I was just, and so I think that. It's not reducible either to democracy or to republicanism. Mm-hmm. These are actually just ways of managing, so to speak, a global crisis of labor. And yeah, so without labor pressing for its own value, There's nothing for Marxism to critique.
If I may respond
Please,
rapidly,
yeah.
sure. Marx's idea of emancipation, meaning the one that I've read, the passage I've read, the idea of emancipation from the enslavement of labor, and is the emancipation from a form of slavery that consists exactly in the fact that you're subject to the arbitrary will of someone. So this is compatible with, similar to, the classical Republican Renaissance idea of liberty. But as you said, Marx goes beyond, has a larger vision of liberty. Now, the question is, this idea of liberty as not be subject to the arbitrary will of someone or something, call it, for instance, the market. Is it valuable for us? I think it is absolutely all we need as the only idea that can sustain us, give us a vision of emancipation or avantage. That's exactly what we need. We don't have such a vision. Let me end with a simple, with a biographical, tedious confession. You said very well that Marxism is dead. You are right. As a structured, systematic ideology, as a body of thought, is dead. And I would say fortunately, because if it was like a cage. I've lived in periods in which many of my fellow comrades believed that Marxism was the answer to everything. No, it's not, it cannot be, but it is, and it can be the answer to what I've described as the dream of humanity. It is to have living in freedom. And, if I may say so, you said something, among the many important things you said something particularly beautiful. You know what? If you commit your life to a vision of emancipation, your life, your individual life is richer. And Marxism can do that if we give it its correct meaning. So in order to make Marx's ideas important for us, we have to liberate Marx's ideas from incorrect interpretations to dogmatic applications. And what we should do is exactly what it has been done many times in history, bringing back to life ideas of the past as Machiavelli taught us. It means to get them right, as their authors intended them. And there is this richness in Marx that we should definitely retrieve. That's all I was saying.
I think briefly I'll say, I'm realizing that we just have maybe different ideas of what Marxism is.
Oh, sure.
Or maybe that's one of the
That's why
beauties
we
of
have
Marx.
these panels.
Yeah, that's why we're here, right? So, but I would say that, I mean, listening to you both, and I appreciate your comments, because I was just listening to you and thinking like, wow, does that match up with what I would say? This is what Marxism is to me. And it's interesting because I find myself leaning a bit more towards you, Maurizio, but also like respecting like the work of Platypus, and being involved in Platypus a little bit and attending some events. It's like one of the things I've always respected most is how deeply read in the history you are, and the debates, and the historical and political context. I find myself today tending more towards this vision of emancipation, and that in combination with the imminent critique of capitalism. Like those do seem really deeply core parts of Marxist, the project, or at least the vision of what it could be. And I realized I didn't answer one of the other questions that is the point of this panel, which is, what are Marxist intellectuals for? Are we even necessary? Good. And I would say, I don't know, maybe we're trying to figure that out. Are we necessary? Is it necessary, to have us studying this history and debate? I mean, I love doing it, but I'm also sometimes skeptical of what are we doing? Is it necessary? And I'm not really sure about that either. I mean, I do love the history and think it's important to know, but at the same time, if we're all here hoping that there's going to be some revolutionary change in the social order, is this necessary? And I don't know. I know I like doing it. I just don't know if it's necessary or not.
All right, and we're going to open up for a Q&A. So if you have a question, please, okay, slowly and carefully file on the right side of the room.
Oh, it's the questions.
Oh, the questions.
Yeah.
So this is an army, an assault. It's against you, so you have to stand.
Well, I first want to thank all three of you. This is
I
one
thought
of the best.
everybody was leaving.
platypus-
In fact, they are attacking, not retreating.
This is definitely like amongst one of the best platypus panels I've, witnessed, and it kind of really testifies to like our diversity of thought for like conventions and panels, right? Because if I can draw a religious analogy here, we basically witnessed a conversation between Kierkegaard and the Orthodox priest, right? That's how big of the divide.
Hold on, who's
He's the
Kierkegaard?
priest. He's the
You're
priest.
Kierkegaard.
Yes, I have done my job. Yes, I will take that any day of the week. Thank you
And
for
he's
that.
the priest.
Orthodox priest. Yes.
Very good. So I'm safe.
I find both
We
to
called
be
the priest. Would have been disastrous.
correct in
I would not have
their own
survived.
regard and their own purposes. But I guess my question for you guys is, these. I wouldn't say necessarily competing, but the point is different, right? For your Marxism and your Marxism. So and the horizon is different, right? So do you think they're commensurable, or do you think there has to be like a theological like battle to be fought out? Hopefully not in a sectarian sense. Thank you.
You respond immediately.
Yeah, I mean,
so-
I think they are commensurable for sure. I mean, I think as someone who's been involved in horribly toxic sects, I mean, I want to get away from sectarian life. That's part of why I like being up here. I think the idea of the horizon being different is really key. Like, where does it end? Like, where is our horizon? I think for the kind of Marxism that I find meaningful and valuable, it's like an ever-receding horizon, which is terrifying and frustrating, but also it strikes me as deeply meaningful. Like, maybe there will never be an end to it. It will always be an ideal that you're striving for. But, Clint, for you, I'm curious, like, do you see a horizon for, like, your vision or, like, your understanding of Marxism?
I think the issue is that, so you can kind of think about it like this, but like let's put it this way, all of world history may have meant nothing if socialism isn't achieved, and Marxism is the critique of that, and so like and therefore the irrelevance of Marxism is part of the irrelevance of world history. So, like, I think that's why I don't think Marxism is a method or like a personal experience. I think it's much more about having the totality of global capital in view, and the necessity of, like, if we are not organizing, building for socialism, which of course many people are, but it's not getting us anywhere. And so it's just being cognizant of that fact in a critical way, that it's like, okay, we might actually be just constantly running on this treadmill, on this hamster wheel, going nowhere and trying the same very old things at the same time that, like, our consciousness of the problem is itself degrading. And so it's just the minimal consciousness of that is what I'm holding on to.
Yeah.
Because we live in an era where there's really no more world history happening. As they said on the panel earlier today, it's just shit's happening.
Oh, that's interesting.
Things are just happening. They may not have any meaning.
Do you mind if I say something to that? I guess I would this almost strikes me as like the observer problem in, like, hard sciences, which is like, I mean, but we are observing it from somewhere, and even the claim that, like, shit's just happening, there is no more world history is, I mean, even that is, like, maybe speaking to the state of the world that we're in. I mean, sure, like, we're post-Fukuyama, right? Like, the end of history, but I mean, there was a lot of Marxists like Bediou and all sorts of people talking about, yeah, but like 9/11, the war on terror, like restarted the engine of history. We are like dealing with something now, even if we don't know what it is.
But history is the history of freedom.
If you believe it.
Yeah.
So, like, we might have another world war. That doesn't mean that that's still history at the level of shit happening, and not history at the level of, okay, we're making a qualitative shift on the order of the Neolithic revolution, rise of agricultural civilization, on the order of the bourgeois revolution, the global slave revolt, where we no longer live in caste society. Like that order of history, which I don't think is happening, but which was once possible.
Right. But you think just shit's happening at this point?
I think it's the left's responsibility to make it so that this is not just shit happening.
On that we agree.
Yeah.
On that we agree. I think that's actually where we become very commensurable in our different perspectives. Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask about Marxism as a critique of history, and you were just kind of talking about this. And I think this is one of the crucial elements of Marxism that the left today has abandoned. I think the majority of the left today treats the 20th century as a stream of victories, like maybe some bad things happen, there's a couple world wars, but we had the New Deal, we had decolonization, we had social democracy, we had the Cuban and Chinese revolutions. We just heard today on our first panel, the Cuban family code, right? The gains of the 20th century, the gains of the welfare state. These are all things that the left won in the 20th century that we have to defend. And a lot of the left's politics is built around this idea of the victories of the 20th century, and it's a very affirmative view. And yet we see today we live under a triumphant global capitalism where the international workers movement, let alone the socialist movement, is long dead, not only in the core capitalist countries like in the United States where it really matters, but also everywhere. How does the left's affirmation of the history of the 20th century, but also history in general, betray Marxism's critical method and actually end up affirming the present in a conservative way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, I think that's the problem. So like, Stalinism doesn't mean like an evil dude in control of a state. It's a world historical Thermidorian reaction. It's where it's like, okay, we are living in this long Thermidorian winter, and we're calling it victory, and we're affirming everything as a victory, and that's precisely the way that we keep piling up defeats. But
does anyone else want to comment on that?
No, I think there is a lot of work to be done. Meaning, if you take seriously the idea that you want to commit yourself to the principle that you don't want human beings treated as slaves, you have a lot of work to do. Now, I was, for instance, when I talking about emancipation from arbitrary domination, consider how many millions and millions of workers are treated today like slaves. They have no rights. Consider also the condition of many, many women around the world. They are under the domination of men. These two. Or consider the conditions of many minorities in the world. No rights, no protection. So if you embrace the idea that you want to see a world in which no one is dominated, then you have a lot of work to do. The question is, why is it the case that in our own times, in our own days, your generation, we no longer see the type of human beings that existed in the 19th centuries? Let me give you an example. People who were doctors, who were teachers, who were craftsmen, who were, you name it, but who dedicated their lives to organize workers, unions, to write books, to teach, to instruct, to inspire. The ideas are there, it seems to me. It doesn't take much effort to find them in the works of the authors we are discussing, beginning with Marx. But it takes more than that to bring ideas back into life and to create better and new forms of social life. It takes faith. It takes devotion. That's why I ended my short presentation by indicating the name of Carlo Rosselli and others who saw that to live your life for a mission, then we go, is the best way to make your life meaningful. But why is it that today this type of figures, maybe I'm wrong, no longer exist? So ideas unless they are transformed into words, and words sustained by the example of those who are speaking for those ideas. They are dead. So we have the ideas if we look carefully in our tradition.
Yeah.
But something else is missing. I'm trying to think what exactly is missing. I have a word in mind that I have used in my last book. We need someone, women and men, who can be similar to prophets. People who can inspire. That's where we are. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I think we have the ideas. What we miss are the persons who can transform those ideas into movements, practices,
Yeah, I would agree.
visions.
Maybe something kind of on this note that just add a thought. I absolutely agree. I mean, I would say like prophets, leadership, visionaries are key. And I wonder if it's also not just that we're missing something, but we have too much of something as well.
Too much, too bad.
Because I think about
Absolutely right.
someone who's been influential on me in my trying to understand the just absolute tragedies of the 20th century, but also my experiences in leftist organizing today. I think about Enzo Traverso's Left-Wing Melancholia.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, do you know this book, Maurizio?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, because the idea is that maybe the reason why we're so kind of attached to like these, sort of whatever the remnants were, whatever happened of like Stalinism or whatever it might be, the idea that it isn't just that those things failed, it's like they were defeated, tragedies happened, incomprehensible like suffering and destruction happened. But I think like the melancholic relationship to these things is that we can't come to terms and reckon with the failures of them and the defeats. And so we find it is very easy in a very unconscious way to be deeply attached to these things. And so we don't have the ability to be visionaries and see a possible future for whatever labor the left could be in the future. So I think to me that's been really helpful too, is just to say, wait, maybe the problem is we're missing something. It's like we have something and we don't even know how to talk about it, but it's keeping us deeply attached in a melancholic way to the failures of the 20th century and the death of the left, which, if the platypus kind of slogan motto is, the left is dead, long live the left, it's like part of the left is dead means we have to reckon with that and our own relationship to that. And for me, maybe as a therapist and someone interested in psychology and psychoanalysis, that's a deeply psychological thing to have to deal with. It's like, what does that really mean for you in your life that you might have a deep melancholic attachment to these things? I will tell you that has ruined more than a few good organizing projects I've been a part of. So,
Melancholia is a cold passion, makes your soul dry and cold
it slaps,
and dissolves.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So we do have a lot of questions.
Good Lord.
We have about 40 minutes left. So if each person with a
Never
question
seen
can just
anything
have
like this
one
in my
question,
life.
that'd make things go a lot smoother.
Normally people can't
And
deal-
I hate to impose this constraint, but if we can
we've
try
been
and
very-
keep the response times around 4 minutes, I'll signal
1
y'all.
minute.
So I'll keep this as quick as I can. But my question was about the distinction between bourgeois society and bourgeois freedoms and Marxism and the conception of freedom under Marxism. Because the thread I noticed between the panelists' introductions, particularly between Adam and Maurizio, and also Clint in your choice of like what history you wanted to present, I noticed that there was a fixation on the attainment of bourgeois right. And there's like the presence of a kind of bourgeois humanism in the conversation. And what I wanted to ask, and this is something I sympathize with, by the way, and I feel it come up in myself, but the question I wanted to ask is, when we consider Marxism, are we just doing Jefferson, or are we just like doing the French Revolution, or is Marxism something that transcends that to a greater degree? And how do we understand that distinction?
So I think it's important to recognize that it's not Marxism doing Jefferson and Montesquieu, but that's actually just what social reality is. And so like there's nothing else besides bourgeois right. The point is that bourgeois right is becoming contradictory.
Exactly.
It's falling apart, and that's what. And so it's not like we have a like another theory called Marxism or another theory called industrialism or socialism or something. Socialism is like coming in the 19th century out of bourgeois right. It's the workers asserting their right, the right of labor. So that doesn't mean like literally like, okay, you know, like my life, liberty, and happiness, right? Like the life, liberty, and happiness, like that bourgeois right isn't about me, isn't about you. It's about society. So it's like life, liberty, and happiness guarantees that society can transform itself. And like that is now in crisis. And that's what makes Marxism necessary. So that's why I was emphasizing that Marxism is just the critique of that, the collapse of bourgeois society.
If I could addend to my question to that, yes, I agree that socialism is an expression of bourgeois right, of course. But Marxism as a critique
Expanded.
of that, what is that?
You have to make it consistent. This is to say, Marx and the socialist critiques, the critics of bourgeois society, they are simply saying, you have proclaimed, asserted the idea of liberty as non-domination, but you do not extend, you do not apply that idea to everyone.
So I think this might be a place where, so I would say that what's key about the domination is that it's the domination of all of society by capital, the capitalists and the workers. So I mean, yes, that extends to all of like our interpersonal dominations and like the dominations of imperialism and all of that sort of stuff. But the key issue is that all of society, all of history is now dominated by capital. And I think that's what the kind of point that you're driving at, namely that there is this demonic part of Marxism, where it's like, okay, the industrial forces of production have so rendered bourgeois right obsolete, so to speak, that like we can now go into an entirely unprecedented horizon. And Marxism is that sort of pioneering into like beyond bourgeois society.
Exactly.
So there is something that's demonic about it. That's not reducible to the past. But like that demonic aspect is something that's coming out of the crisis of bourgeois society.
I guess if anything, I love the demonic aspect of Marxism personally. I mean, I think maybe reading earlier eras of Marx and like more philosophical works, I mean, I think today the things I read that really strike me as most interesting that are coming from the tradition of Marxism do speak to something that is beyond bourgeois individualism, that by going through it, there is something where we start to redefine what it is to be an individual subject, that there is something that creates the conditions for that vision to then be achieved, but what that vision is something beyond that. What that is, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think that's a philosophical question I wrestle with all the time. But I know, like, in a lot of the ways I think about Marxism, one of the assumptions around it, or one of the things I think it can be most radical for, is giving us a way to think about what would society be like that wasn't structured on just attaining like bourgeois individual rights.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent answers.
So this one's a bit lengthy. I'll
Narration.
I'll talk fast. So much of the main driving force behind a lot of millennial leftist movements that you've seen, like whether it's Sanders, Corbyn, Podemos, Dylinka, they don't have their base of support really in a classical proletariat, which you see swinging more and more to the far right, especially in Europe, but rather from a more professional, educated class that fears proletarianization. There's a much of a lack of class awareness in a qualitative sense, like a recognition of a historical task, and more so in like a vague quantitative sense. So, Clint, when you were talking about the kind of, we're just reliving the New Deal all the time until the heat death of the universe. So why has this emancipatory impulse atrophied so heavily in current conditions? Or to say it differently, is there any way to salvage the vision of the 19th century from the wreckage of the 20th?
Absolutely. Yes. If you want to do that, if you really are serious to that, you have to do exactly what they did in the 19th century. And to begin with associating human beings, not just the proletariat, if they exist, but every human being, all the human beings who have a generous heart, who stand for moral dignity. So that's how it started. with forming associations, unions, cultural clubs, reading groups, platypus. It started like that in the 19th century. You have to imagine when the socialist movement began in Europe in the 19th century. When the socialist and social democratic parties were founded and established and grew, it was because they were, first of all, the militants and the leaders were emancipating the oppressed classes, but also the intellectuals, but also the people who were part of the so-called middle class, from the sense of powerlessness, from solitude. So that's the first step, form associations in which at least human beings don't stay in this horrible condition in which we all, more or less, are lonely. We are lonely. That's exactly what makes it difficult to have projects of emancipation, because if you want to be effective, remember, I said I have impeccable socialist credentials. That's true, but I also have impeccable Machiavellian credentials. For me, what I'm interested in what is right, but also I'm interested in making what I think is right win. And this is the only realistic approach is to try. I'm not a Christian, but we should imitate the Christian spirit when, in dark times, the first thing they were doing were staying together, forming associations and talking and thinking and reading.
So I think a big problem with the millennial left was the focus on, if we can just get people elected to technocratically manage the state.
Absolutely.
And so socialism became a word to justify being a pressure group on the Democratic Party via electoralism.
Okay.
So I think I would agree with you that what the left needs to do is, or what's needed is just the creation of civil social relations, associations, etc. Like there's actually because we have this, because the old socialist parties, they were a civil social base out of which with an electoral arm.
That can be done.
Right. Well, it's very difficult. But yes, I agree. But the millennial left had it sort of ass backwards, where it was like, okay, once we start getting these technocratic reforms in, then we can start, problematizing capitalism, and that's where I think a lot of the fear of the working class came from, and this sort of self-paranoia of the PMC, and that really poses the question of what the point of intellectuals are.
Okay.
I mean, one thing I would add too, if the idea is is it possible to salvage the vision of the 19th century? I mean, I immediately thought, we're talking about emancipation, we're talking about all these things. I mean, one of the things that also was destroyed in the 20th century was proven to show that whenever it actually did come to pass, or whatever it meant, it actually led to the exact opposite of emancipation. It led to global destruction, was the idea of progress. So I think maybe another question I would ask is what do we mean by progress now, if we're going to talk about that? Is it just managing the technocratic state? Is it like a radical emancipatory vision?
It's linear progress, it's automatic, it's cold. It's better to speak of emancipation, believe me.
Yeah.
But I would say also, there was a reason why society was progressing.
Progressive too.
There was a reason why they believed in historical progress.
Sure.
And that is
more damaging.
Traumatic that it hit that.
Exactly.
But the Belle Epoque.
You don't have to have faith in the final victory of socialism. This is damaging, because when the march stops, then you get depressed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on this note,
you have to have faith in the value of your principles, because nothing and nobody can defeat those.
Well, and I subscribe to a position called the courage of hopelessness in this respect. So that's kind of my
subscribe
position.
to. Very nice. You put it nicely, man.
It's Agamben. I'm stealing it from Agamben, but I think it has a lot of saying yes. Like, if we believe in progress, or whatever, when that stops, we collapse with it. But there has to be something else, that we can embrace the failure and the wreckage of the 20th century, but still move
if
through.
I'm not wrong, I see one, two, probably three of my students who heroically are coming to they are heroes, because they suffer through my lectures. Nonetheless, You see, if I had to say something to them, I would say, look, a life dedicated to a vision of emancipation is more fun than a life dedicated to the family and business.
Hear, hear. So,
That's another one, a survivor from my classes.
Yeah, I was just saying, as one of the survivors of Viroli's classes, I actually have 3 questions addressed to each one of you, but I'll limit it to one. So I'll ask specifically Professor Viroli. You concluded by talking about liberal socialism. So I'm interested if you could talk about, I guess more generally, what is liberal socialism for? Because if we start off by talking about what is Marxism for, I'm interested how you can lead that to what is liberal socialism for in the modern age.
Liberal socialism, socialismo liberale, is the English translation of this book published by Karl Rosselli, an anti-fascist martyr. His idea was very simple in theory, very difficult to put it in practice. His idea was that socialism as a theory of social justice must incorporate the best of the liberal tradition of individual rights. In fact, liberal socialism is an idea that was a political idea that was critical of both Stalin totalitarianism and capitalist exploitation. Therefore, he said that a viable, a decent project of emancipation must avoid both the errors of Stalinism and Leninism, and be able to be a reformist project for the injustices of capitalist society. But the real importance of that story is, I think, of liberal socialism, is that it's a theory that originated from defeats, the terrifying defeat of the victory of fascism in Italy. Those people like Rosselli and Gramsci, they were in jail or in confinement. And they understood something that in both of them you find this idea, that unless, that I'm citing, senza coscienze libere nessuna società libera. Without free consciences, you cannot have a free society. This is beyond Marx. But in the sense of recuperating the best of the early Marx. So, and in these days, I think that what I fear we are missing are free consciences. This is to say, the sense, as Rosselli said, of the depth and of the inner individual life as a value. Why? Because if you have free human beings who want only to obey to their own conscience, you cannot turn them into slaves. They will never applaud Mussolini. That's exactly this, you can help me. Human beings who have a profound respect for their own individuality are difficult to be enslaved. That's why Rosselli wanted to combine the socialist aspiration to social justice with this aspect of liberal ideas that cherish, that encourage the value of inner individuality.
My question is for Professor Viroli. You mentioned how during the 18th, 17th century, or the Enlightenment era, they were looking back.
In the
Enlightenment era,
sure.
They were looking back towards the age of Rome to rediscover republicanism in a way. And you mentioned how, there's a need to perhaps bring back Marxism, to rediscover it in a way. So I wanted to ask, do you think the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat is something we should also bring back?
No. No, for the reason, because it's dictatorship and because it's of the proletariat, namely dictatorship. No, it's okay. If it is of the proletariat, however large proletariat was supposed to be, it's a particular class. And so you don't want, to replace the domination of a particular class with the domination of another particular class. Why Marx theorized the dictatorship of the proletariat? Well, because he thought the proletariat was going to become the universal class. The entire society was going to become divided into smaller and smaller minority of capitalists and the immense majority of proletariats. That's not true. The proletariats are just a part of society. And second, because it's a dictatorship in the sense in which Marx uses the term. He adopts it from, he was very knowledgeable, as a temporary measure. In fact, he knew it from Roman law, in which the senatus consultus ultimum, the Senate was appointing, giving extraordinary powers to someone on the battlefield for a given time. The problem is that dictatorships, they tend to reproduce themselves and become not temporary but permanent, and we don't need them. Why we don't need them? We don't need them because you don't have. I cannot imagine a socialist revolutionary radical experience like a war. Today is more like conquering in the moral sense the conscience and touching the passions of our fellow citizens. So since I don't think of socialist practice as a war, you don't need an institution that was framed for war.
Really quickly, yeah, I know that was just for Viroli, but I would like to open that up to the other panelists. Just, what are your thoughts on the dictatorship of the proletariat? Is it a necessity, and how does that relate to Marxism?
I'll just say that some of the organizing experience I've had, it's definitely been something that has tried to be preserved, and I think what ends up happening is the assumption of wartime conditions from the term itself starts to structure organizations in a way that makes them very hierarchical, very much about dominance of the members. And so for me, I found that very quickly it seemed like a term to get away from very quickly, if for no other purpose than to just hopefully minimize subjugation and domination within your leftist organization.
So I guess two points. One, it was an unimaginable idea to have the suppression of free speech any time before 1929 in the Socialist International. The Socialist International was what was making possible the free exchange of ideas. It was in the conditions of industrial exploitation. It was actually enabling those sorts of civil social associations that you were talking about, and allowing people to develop free conscience. I agree that it was within that sort of context of the Socialist International that you had free speech, that you had civil associations, that you had free conscience, and then secondly. I do not think that the revolution in Russia or in Germany was the dictatorship of the proletariat.
It was the dictatorship of the Central Committee of the Communist Party.
Yes, and so so we have to understand what was the revolution in Russia about? And it was about lighting the first match to have the revolution in Europe. And then we've never even tried the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the whole point of it is just to raise to political consciousness the crisis of capitalist social relations. And so I guess my question is then and that's why I kind of pointed out that it's when with the advent of industrialism and you have mass democracy, there's no mass democracy before industrialism, and the masses vote for Louis Bonaparte to be their dictator.
Exactly.
And so Marx is saying, the class will have to fill that role. So I think it does come down to whether or not we think of the proletariat as a particular universal class. And that's why I don't think the proletariat is a stratum. It's not like how much money do you have. I think that we would have many Wall Street capitalists helping us lead the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Sure. That's fact.
It's not rich and poor. It's about how do we get beyond this crisis of industrial labor. I think there would be plenty of Wall Street capitalists.
I never seen such
So there
many
seems to be
people.
a there seems to be a bit of a specter, if you will, haunting this panel. So, for instance, Adam. Yeah. So, Adam, you brought up Walter Benjamin, who, as you know, is very theological, heavily influenced by certain aspects of Jewish mysticism. And then Viroli, you bring up how we need a prophet, as you said. And then I was waiting in line. You said we need to also take up the certain Christian spirit. And then Clint, you brought up how there's various demonic aspects as well. So if Marxism is about, as Viroli, you said, about overcoming all these arbitrary powers, including God, as you said, then how can Marxists overcome capitalism if we haven't, as it seems, even overcome religion, or as Carl Schmitt might say, the structure of religion at the very least?
Mm-hmm. You are the first being accused.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll step up to the plate.
It's your moment.
I mean, it seems that in your question you're assuming that religion and the structure of religion is something that is inherently going to get into the way. I think in my experience, being on the left and studying the history to the degree that I have, I don't know if that's the case. If we go back to the idea of religion as the opiate of the masses, it's also important to remember that it was a very necessary salve for the pains and the experiences of people within the social order that were being dominated and destroyed. So I think that in my experience today, I think having some at least understanding or way of relating to some, dare I say, messianic vision of the world, and some way of understanding the way that communities and how we're talking about civil societies and all these ways of trying to fill in the gap of what it is to be in community together, how to associate together to overcome alienation. I think religion is at least something that might be very necessary for the human experience. It is for me, and I actually find a great sort of productive tension between thinking about religion and religious practice and Marxism together. The warm streams of Marxism have been the ones that have always drawn me most closely to them. Maybe that's why I'm Kierkegaard up here, which I will gladly accept. So,
in my opinion, and I am anticipating a lecture that I shall give in my class when I shall be lecturing on Marx. Marx was even too benevolent, too kind to religion when he described it as the opium of the people. At times, religion is the amphetamine of the people, because opium makes you dormant and sleepy, harmless. Many times, look at religious fundamentalists in the world. They are not sleepy. They are active. They are aggressive. They have taken amphetamines, not opium. This said, I think that if we are realistic, we should never, ever, particularly in this country, particularly in the United States, ever as socialists, appear as being against Christianity, against religion, because this is a recipe for isolation and defeat. Well, we should do something much different, namely to extract from the existing religious traditions of this country, of any country, those words, those examples, and those traditions that have spoken for emancipation. There are. I've been a professor at Princeton for 27 years. One of my colleagues was at the Institute for Advanced, was Michael Walzer. Michael Walzer has written a magnificent book, a spectacular book called Exodus and Revolution. And he shows that over times in history, successful prophets and apostles and militants of social emancipation have been able to extract from the Old Testament and the New Testament and religious traditions powerful ideas. That's exactly what we should do. It's completely absurd to say that we should get rid of religion as such. If people feel the need for religious experience, we have to respect and tell them what. Say, are you really a Christian? If indeed I am, they might reply, well, if you are a Christian, you certainly want to be only under God, not under man. You cannot be a servant, become a slave of other human beings, because you have only to freely respect God. And if you are a Christian, you have to stand for the Christian value, which is caritas, compassionate love, that translates into solidarity, into affectionate care, taking care. So that's what my suggestion. Never, ever, I don't believe in God, but I would never, ever say anything that might hurt the religious good feelings of good people.
And I completely agree, and I would just abide by the simple revolutionary bourgeois separation of church and state.
You need more than that.
I know.
That's a defensive one. You need more. You have to
No,
bring
but
those who believe in God to
but
believe in
I'm
the
not-
right God.
Sure. I'm not talking at the level of.
Sorry,
I know. Of religion per se. I would just say that enlightenment is a very tenuous achievement. It's a very tenuous achievement, and it's something that can be lost. And we can just slip back into mystical consciousness. It's very possible. Nothing says that this has to, the church is waiting for open arms for us to, get out of this fever dream of modernity, And so, but so I'm saying, so like at the level of just like what Marxism is, that is not the religious aspect. It is a tenuous, it is the Enlightenment under the Industrial Revolution.
I'm going to take this religious argument to a more concrete level, maybe. So one of the things that I'm hearing is a totally, again, going away from the foundation's definition of labor unions as economic, not changing social relations between workers, which is really, truly important, and it's the only reason to be involved in the labor movement as far as I'm concerned. It also feels to me like we're ruthlessly criticizing things that don't need to be criticized, particularly not if they're dead, as the left is dead according to Platypus Society. My experience is different, and I think the only cure for melancholia is action. Okay. And I believe that there are many people in this country in action. I think when we talk about something like the millennial left, it's like talking about the white working class. It doesn't exist. I see the left as a continuum in terms of anti-fascist and anti-racist and anti-imperialist action, and we've seen a lot of it. So that's my experience, and that's my observation point, and that's what I'm interested in. And I wouldn't call it faith, I'd call it an honest assessment of where we are. So I was wondering if you all thought of a left as having continuity.
Quickly, I would say to that point, and when I think about the work that I've done, I would say that action is something that comes whenever mourning can take place about what has been lost. So I think for me, like saying, okay, if we're not in melancholia about the 20th century and what the defeats and what we've lost, we mourn that, and then we figure out what action is happening now, whether that's anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-imperialist. And I think that does lead to a bigger question of like, what is Marxism for? Is it relevant? It's like, well, do you need Marxism to be participating in those things? Like, does Marxism still provide a coherent way of organizing around those things? And so I think that to me is where other perspectives, like more, sort of more recent critiques and ways of understanding capital and like the social order and like different forms of domination actually do become very important, like feminist critique, anti-racist critique. Those things I think have enormous value if they help us understand like what is action today.
Yeah, I want to define, I'm not talking about critique in general.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about critique that says that, for example, the new left is anti-Marxist,
Mm-hmm.
which I do not agree with.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be. If they
Yeah.
were intelligent, they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Well, it's in the pamphlet.
I don't think you have to be against Marxism.
Well, yeah, I don't think that it's not that like somebody's just like straight up anti-Marxist. It's that like we're dealing with the actual historical regression of Marxism. So many things have been done in the name of Marxism, and we're not saying that like, oh, this one or that one is the correct one. We're simply posing the problem that none of them have led to socialism.
Well, that has a bunch of reasons, not only.
That's what we have to work through. But that's the psychoanalytic component of like having to work through the very real trauma at a global historical level.
I'm fine on mourning. I mean, mourning is fine. Melancholia is not.
I'm not mourning. I want to
two different things.
I want to
Different
overcome.
things, yeah.
I mean, it's much more Freudian. It's the ego repeating its trauma in order to go beyond it.
I'm a Marxist in the sense of, I think Adam is a Marxist, and we're Marxists in the same kind of way.
Yeah.
It's not a doctrinaire approach, but neither was the New Left. I mean, there was a wide range of experience, and I don't think any of it was, very little of it I would brand as anti-Marxist. Any more than I brand the Black Panthers as anti-Marxist.
No, it's precisely their self-conception of Marxist that's interesting.
Right. That I agree with. But I don't think the left is dead.
Neither I.
Well, that is hopefully a question that we can dispute and answer over these coming months.
Yeah, I certainly have a lot more critiques that I'm glad to shout over a few adult apple juices at some point. But I mean, I think one of the things I do want to bring up though is like I keep hearing this the concept of the proletariat, whether there is a proletariat, whether the proletariat is dead, the so-called proletariat. I think we need to start from a definition, just so people might be aware. I assume everybody here has some working knowledge, but like a proletariat being, the class of people who do not have any land, who do not have any, saved up materials, who have to work day in and day out to sell their labor for their subsistence, who are not, accumulating capital, who are not even, sometimes accumulating a little bit of extra resource. But I mean, as we know, that's so illusory to have just a little bit of money, the way inflation goes and whatnot. But anyway, I bring up all this because like it's weird to hear that the proletariat may not even exist when we have more and more tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people within this country alone who are absolutely within that category. Now, certainly factory labor is not, as prevalent. I mean, obviously, like there are not as many factories, et cetera. So the quote unquote traditional definition is not as it was. But nonetheless, the number of people who are living day to day with no money to survive has grown exponentially. Where their consciousness is at on a day to day, whether they see themselves as a part of a proletariat, they are in fact a class of people who share that same, level of economic exploitation. So I'm just wondering, like, what, I guess I wonder, like, what the critiques are, what the rationale is for saying that, there is no proletariat or the proletariat may not exist, etc.
Let me, for myself, unless I was out of my mind, which might have happened, I've never thought there are no proletariats. It is exactly in the sense that you and Marx together, you are in agreement on this, you have defined it. Proletariats are those who live of their labor force. They have to sell their labor force for a salary. These are the proletariats. They exist, there are millions of them, their conditions, I'm not a sociologist, but my simple perception as an old man, I can see, it seems to me that their social standing, their conditions of life have not got better, it seems to me. In terms of social recognition, they have not got better. In many countries, including Europe, they are paid almost nothing now. The salaries are miserable, and they have no force to improve their social condition. My argument was never that there is no longer a proletariat or the proletariat as a class is irrelevant. I'm saying you need more than the proletariat to attain goals of social justice. For instance, you have to have the middle class, the intellectuals, women, the young men and women. You have to. That's why I cited Gramsci. With the proletariat, you need other social groups. And what would be the world? Which values, which principles might help us to bring along the proletariat other social forces and to win? That's all I've been saying and preaching today, this idea of liberty as emancipation from arbitrary domination. That's, I think, is powerful.
Just to interject really quickly, we don't have a lot of time left. I want to respect everyone's time and get everyone out as quickly as possible. If y'all two can answer, and then we get your question.
I would just say, like, if we're thinking about the proletariat as a sociological stratum, as like a group of poor people or who have to live by a wage, then yes, I would also not support them taking political power and wielding it in the name of themselves.
Of course.
Right? The proletariat is a freedom problem. It is the contradiction of modernity. It's the entire, the revolution of labor has become industrial, and that's what the proletariat is. So yes, I would say, if you want to think, it's like thinking sociologically about it it kind of misses the point in my mind. It's like, sure, like anybody can come and join the proletarian struggle beyond capital. People who will be slaving away at Wall Street, will be slaving away in their middle class jobs, doing all kinds of things. It's not like you take somebody's sociological background and then therefore define their class consciousness. Like, class consciousness is historical consciousness, it's critical consciousness. Yeah.
I'll just quickly say, coming from like a very working class background, everyone I know that I grew up with defines themselves as capitalists. And so to me, it's like, I'll be a bit of a Maoist about this. Like, becoming the proletariat or defining that is through struggle, comrades. So, I would think about like, who's doing that work, right? Like, who's out there like helping people just develop that consciousness? That's a struggle that is happening.
Hi. Thanks to all of the panelists for all of your time and your patience with our many, many questions. So at first, I just wanted to offer up a formulation from Georg Lukács, who we read in the Platypus Reading Group, which is that Marxism is the self-consciousness of the proletariat, of its historical purpose to abolish itself. And in that sense, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is aimed at the self-abolition of the proletariat, in that sense, the DOP is necessary to abolish social domination, which is the product of the working class, right? It's the proletariat that produces the commodity form. And so it's in that sense that it's like the historical, its self-knowledge of its historical purpose to abolish all class for all time. That's Lukács's formulation for Marxism. So first, I wanted to offer that formulation. And second, so my question is for Professor Viroli. So you said at the beginning of your remarks that you've always been a socialist, but never a Marxist. And I think just to go back to the beginning and some of the history that you and Clint both raised in your discussion, Marxism was a critique of socialism, right? Not of capitalism. It was a critique of capitalism insofar as it was a critique of contemporary socialism. The First International splits over Marxism versus other forms of pre-Marxist socialism, including anarchism. And out of that, the Marxists go on to the Second International, which the crown jewel of is the German SPD. That leads to the Russian Revolution and a series of defeats and the horrible long 20th century. So my provocation would be, is the temptation to say we're socialists but not Marxists basically an attempt to expunge ourselves or wash our hands of the history of the turn that socialism took? And are you saying it's possible to go back and relitigate the split of the First International?
Wonderful
Thank you.
question. Spectacular question. Well, when I say I am a socialist and not a Marxist, I mean that, as I think I have explained, that I do not share the entire corpus of Marx theories, unless you are prepared to accept, for instance, Marx's theory of the inevitable collapse of capitalism. That is not believable. That's exactly, if you believe that, then you go back to the ideology of most socialist and social democratic parties in the late 19th century. This is to say, the idea that the collapse will come. The collapse will come. The revolutionary crisis will come. All we have to do is to organize, to get ready for that moment. That's not I think this is not the right way. This is not, in realistic terms, the best way to be active for social emancipation. But you have the fact that I'm saying I'm a socialist doesn't mean that I am not critical of the experiences of socialist parties in the 19th century. You have correctly cited the Second International, and you have mentioned the jewel of the Second International, the Deutsche Sozialdemokratie. They were the foundation. But you know better than me, and you are absolutely right to cite that example. They voted for the credits of wars, is to say, they betrayed what? Socialist principles. So when I say I'm a socialist, I don't mean I am social in the sense of the Second International. When I say I'm a socialist, I simply mean that I stand for the principles of social liberty and social emancipation that you can find in the early Marx. That's exactly what I think we need. In spite of the terrifying mistakes of the socialist parties, consider just this. In Italy, to give you an example, in Italy, we have had one of the oldest socialist parties founded in 1892. From that party in 1921 came the Communist Party. I was born in one of the best governed regions of Italy, Emilia-Romagna. So good that an acclaimed Harvard sociologist, Professor Robert Putnam, he wrote a book called Making Democracy Work. And you know, and he, even before that, he went to study experiences of good government. He went to Emilia-Romagna to study the administrations of the left. Now, why all that has disappeared? Because of the socialists themselves, because of their leaders, because they did two things, in my opinion, are two crimes, moral, political crimes, not legal crimes. First, the socialists in Italy, but not only in Italy, they became so corrupt that the magistrate, the judiciary had to take hundreds of them to jail. And then the others, they decide that in order to be powerful, all you have to be is to be pragmatic. So to give up visions and hopes and aspirations to justice in order to do that, to govern. These are the two these are the horrible vices of the socialist and communist tradition, but I'm not a socialist in that sense.
Well, I think what's crucial about that, right, is that, so why does the SPD vote for the war credits? It's to preserve the existence of the party at the expense of its purpose. It becomes just a labor party. It becomes just like the racket of labor. It becomes one interest group among many different interest groups, right? And the SPD, they say it, in 1950. Okay, we are no longer a socialist party. We're just a Volkspartei, right? We're just a people's party, right? And so it's like once you like lose the purpose of the party, of course you're just going to become a corrupt capitalist manager, like the Democrats.
And then why you would want to vote for, if you are a citizen, why you would want to vote for that?
I think the left makes a terrible mistake when they say, oh, you have to vote for the socialists.
If the socialists are like those, I don't see why the people should vote for them.
And the left keeps saying things like that.
And you know what happens? Many people with not such a great culture, then they vote for nationalist demagogues. Because nationalist demagogues, they offer wrong visions, but visions instead of just pragmatic politics. It is extremely dangerous to abandon visions for government when you have on the other side people who offer wrong visions, but visions.
And now we have the Popular Front.
Correct.
Yeah, so we've already gone 7 minutes over. I want to give Adam one last chance. Do you have any?
Yeah, very quickly. I've actually had sort of a discussion that's relevant, like on a protest line between, the left and the right, let's say. I call myself a Marxist out of the desire to actually recognize and claim the tragedies of the 20th century, and then to hopefully be able to understand those for myself to such a way that if someone were to ask in a way that is very critical and rejecting, even from a more right-wing perspective, I would be able to engage them in a dialogue about it. To be able to say, yes, there were tragedies. Yes, I call myself a Marxist. Would you like to know more? Why do I do that? I think it's an opportunity to develop more historical consciousness, actually. So that's why I choose to call myself a Marxist still.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Yeah.
Thank you. I've never seen a debate like this in my life.
That was wonderful.
In the last